The next point is students find the learning experience challenging but enjoyable. That means that when we plan our lesson plans, we have to think of activities that are level appropriate. And I think this is a key word here, level appropriate. That means that you have to find activities that are challenging, not too difficult, not too easy, and appropriate and enjoyable. So when you plan your lesson plans, look for activities based on your students' level, lack of knowledge, and to make sure that they're not too difficult nor too easy. If you find that your students are getting bored, more than likely these activities are not appropriate for their level. So always check and evaluate to see what kind of response you get from your students, and that'll let you know if those activities are appropriate or inappropriate for their level. Make sure that they're fun. Students love to have a good time. So when you think of activities, think of dynamic activities. Activities where students are moving around the classroom. They're sharing, they're working in pairs, they're working in groups, competitions. Those types of activities are the activities that your students are going to enjoy the most. And because an English language classroom is different than any other classroom. You're not giving a lecture, remember that, you're not giving a lecture. These students don't speak English, they're in the process of learning the language, so they have to be appropriate, and they have to be challenging, and they have to be enjoyable. So think about that when you're planning your lesson plans. The next point is the communicative syllabus favors function over form. These two words are important, function over form. Function, when we think about function, we think about the use of the language. And when we think of form, we think of grammar, pure grammar, the structures, modal verbs, tenses. That's form. And function is the use of the language. When and how to use the language. So the communicative approach focuses on function. We want to think of objectives that are communicative. That means that when you write your lesson plan objective, you want to write, students will learn how to talk about their last holidays. Students will learn to talk about how to order in a restaurant. That's function. Versus students will learn the simple past. That's form. So we want to try and stay away from form and focus on function. That's really important. The next point is lessons present grammatical structures. ¿Ah? Sí. Lessons. No, arranco. Okay. The next point is lessons present grammatical structures and new vocabulary in communicative activities that give students focused practice. This is a very important key word here. Focused practice. That means that if I'm going to teach how to order in a restaurant, if that's my objective, if that's what I came up with for my students, then I'm going to focus my practice stage on that, how to order in a restaurant. And at the end of the lesson, I'm going to evaluate to see if I accomplished that goal of getting my students to be able to order in a restaurant. So that's really important. Focused practice. When you write your lesson plans, come up with an objective, write a warm-up, write the introduction, teach the lesson, but when you get to the practice stage, you want to make sure that your students are working on that objective, how to order in a restaurant. You're going to choose grammatical structures which are going to help you reach that objective, but your practice stage is going to focus on how to order in a restaurant, or whatever objective it is that you need to come up with for your students. The next point is rote memorization and repetition. They have their place in some situations, but are not emphasized. So rote memorization and repetition are okay if you're working on pronunciation. If you're working on pronunciation, you want to get your students to repeat. They need to learn from you, especially with regards to pronunciation. You are going to be that sample that your students are going to have. You're going to be that source that your students are going to have. So have your students work on pronunciation and repetition. But we don't want to focus on getting our students to repeat and repeat and repeat for the sake of repetition, but where there is no real communication taking place. Remember, if we're working on the communicative approach, we want to make sure that our students are using the language in a real-world context. Therefore, we can't focus on repetition, on just getting our students to repeat and repeat. Maybe you learned a language that way, or tried to learn a language that way, or went through a language learning process that way a while back. Well, we no longer use that. We use repetition only when we're working on pronunciation. When we work on pronunciation, yes, have your students repeat the word or the sentence 3-4 times so that you get the intonation, the stress, the rhythm that you need to develop, or that your students need to develop. The next point is students learn grammatical principles heuristically. That means they're not overloaded with grammar, but discover grammar on their own through examples. So students learn grammar principles heuristically. That means they discover these grammar points on their own. Now, there's been a change of, should we include a lot of grammar? Should we not? There's still a debate going on today about the use of grammar in an EFL or in an ESL classroom. Some people say, well, you shouldn't use form and formulas and grammar in the classroom. Others say, yes, you should. I am in favor of using both. A little bit of grammar and a lot of the use of the language in the classroom. So heuristically, you want your students to be able to pick up on the grammar on their own through examples. If you're able to do that, then you've done a great job. If not, some students won't get it. Some students will have a difficult time learning it. And I think in that case, you need to then bring the information and present it to your students and present the grammar. Because a lot of students have been learning English through grammar. And so it is okay to teach them how to use the language, but also the grammar points as well. Sometimes it helps your students. And I think we need to be open-minded and be able to use any tools that we have, and sometimes grammar formulas can be a tool to use to teach an objective. Students focus on grammar as a framework for guidance, refinement, and self-correction. Students focus on grammar as a framework for guidance, refinement, and self-correction. That's what we have to think about when we think of grammar. We don't want to overload our students with grammar. You don't want to teach too much grammar. You want to choose an objective, make sure that it's communicative, make sure that it's based on a real-world context, and make sure that they're able to use the language spontaneously at the end of your lesson plan. That's why we've provided you guys with a lesson plan with the right stages to be able to, at the end of that lesson plan, take your students to be able to use the language spontaneously. And following those stages, following that process, you're going to be able to do that at the end of your lesson. Errors. Errors are viewed as a natural process of language development. Students are going to make mistakes. It's part of any language learning process. There is no such thing as using the language accurately immediately after you learn a language topic. So expect your students to make errors. Be patient. Patience is extremely important when teaching a language. And expect your students to make those mistakes and correct them. Now, we will go over error correction later on, and error correction is extremely important, and there are different procedures that we can use for correcting our students' mistakes. But expect them, be patient, and understand that your students will make mistakes. Also, help your students accept that. Sometimes you will find students who are perfectionists. Expect to use the language perfectly immediately after you teach it, and that's going to be very difficult. So teach your students to be patient as well. Self-confidence and control, it's the next point. Self-confidence and control of the language builds So does their intrinsic motivation to continue learning. Self-confidence and control. The more your students' confidence in using a language builds, the better they're going to be at using the language, number one. Number two, to continue learning the language. Learning a language is a very difficult task for anyone. So the more you build that motivation, the more you build that confidence as a student learning a language, the better it's going to be for them, and also the longer they're going to continue learning a language. You will find out when you begin teaching English that some of your students are going to quit learning the language because they find it really difficult. So it is important for you to always think about, how can I build my students' confidence? And there will be activities and things that you can do to build your students' confidence. And that may be as basic as saying to your students, great job, that was really good. Things of that nature that are going to build your students' confidence to continue to learn the language. Listening comprehension is also important. The more they understand as they build their listening comprehension skills, which we will also talk later on about it, the better it will be for them to build that confidence and to continue learning the language. The next point is listening, speaking, reading, writing are seen as interrelated skills. These are the 4 language skills in any language, but we have to make sure that they're interrelated. So we build all 4 skills at the same time through different activities: listening and speaking, reading and writing, from basic to intermediate to advanced. We're going to work on activities based on the communicative approach, which are going to develop all 4 skills at the same time, and they're going to be interrelated. Many times we work on listening and speaking at the same time, or reading and writing at the same time, or all 4 at the same time. So you're going to find lots of activities where you may be able to work on all 4 skills at the same time, or individual skills, or speaking and listening, reading and writing. And finally, pair work, small group, are part of the activities that you're going to do to facilitate interaction among your students. So when you think of activities in the practice stage, you want to make sure that your activities are based on pair work and group work. If you're working with your students individually, by the time, if you have 15 or 20 students, if you're the only one that's interacting with them and you're doing it you and the student, by the time you complete 15 or 20 students, the rest of your students are going to be bored. So it is important to simultaneously get your students to work together. Pair work. You assign students to do pair work, you give them the activity, and they all work simultaneously. You just walk around the classroom and check to see how they're doing, if they're performing well, their pronunciation is incorrect, or if they're using the language incorrectly, then you're going to be walking around checking. So it is important that you do pair work and small groups, or class as a whole activity. That's really important for the communicative approach. Now, these are the fundamental points of the communicative approach. Keep them in mind when building your students' language skills and when preparing your lesson plan. Thank you very much.